Good morning, everyone. This week's Torah portion has the very famous story of Hashem telling Moshe Rabbeinu, take your staff and go and speak to the rock and it will produce water for the nation. However, Moshe Rabbeinu, some say Maimonides in a fit of anger says, listen up you rebels, and he strikes the rock not once but twice and it produces water for the nation to drink. And Hashem says to Moshe famously, you failed to sanctify me in the eyes of the nation by speaking to the rock, but rather you struck the rock, and therefore you will be punished. And the punishment is that you will not go into the land of Israel. And then sure enough, Moshe Rabbeinu prays to be allowed to rescind this decree, but in vain God does not allow him, and he ultimately never enters into the land of Israel. There are mountains of questions on this story, but some of the most famous questions is, first of all, what's such a terrible sin? Either way, it's a miracle, whether a rock produces water through speech or through striking it. Either way, it's a miracle. Second of all, why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu listen to Hashem? If Hashem said, speak to the rock, why did he hit the rock? And third of all, the question is famously asked, why is it that Hashem told him to take the stick in the first place? If he's meant to talk to the rock, why does it say, take your staff and speak to the rock? And fourth of all, 40 years earlier, we find that Hashem did tell him to strike the rock. So why then did he tell him to strike the rock, and now he tells him to speak to the rock? It was almost like Hashem was setting him up for failure. And the Medrash gives a very profound but simple answer. You know, when you have a little child, you have to tell them what to do. When you have a little child, you have to tell them, do this, don't do that. You have to do everything by force, with the strength of your authority and your power and your control as a parent. But what happens when your child grows up and they're 40 years old and not 5 years old anymore? Now you can't force them to do anything. Now you have to learn how to persuade them, influence them, rather than coerce them and force them through power. And that's what really happened here. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, 40 years ago, you were dealing with a slave mentality. You were dealing with people who were only used to the stick. They just came out of slavery. All they understood was force and power. And therefore I told you, take the rock, which was a stick, which was a metaphor for power, and strike the rock to produce water. But now it's the next generation. It's 40 years later. You can't use the old tactics. Now you have to learn to speak to them. You have to get to their neshama. You have to inspire them. Because if you hit them, not only won't you influence them, on the contrary, they're just going to build tougher skin and they'll get more resistant. In other words, what he was saying was there's two types of rocks. There are rocks that have water in it and rocks that don't have water. Rocks that don't have water you have to strike. Rocks that have water inside of them, that's why it's called a cell and not a tzur in the second story. You have to learn how to draw out the inner water that they have in them. You know, just a few days ago, the world commemorated the 24th yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said to Herman Wouk, famous author, that Americans, you can't tell them to do anything, but you could explain to them why they should do everything. When you look at the Baal Tshuva movement today, no one became religious today because some religious Jew told them, you must do this. Hashem said you have to keep Shabbos. Hashem said you have to eat kosher. No one responds to that. But if you teach a Jew and inspire them the beauty of Judaism, on their own volition, they'll come to observe all the mitzvot. And that's why there's so many people who have come back to Judaism today, not because someone forced them or coerced them, but because someone brought out their inner water with love. Because America is a very free country, and part of being free is I'm an individual, I can do what I want. You can't tell me what to do. But if you draw out my water through love and inspiration and guidance and teaching me why I should want to do this, then I, on my own, will come to observe all of the mitzvot. Just to conclude with a story they tell about Rabbi Beryl Wine was once giving a lecture in Miami Beach. And he was talking about how to influence people, how to inspire people. And he told the story that in the Chafetz Chaim's yeshiva in Radin, Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan, there was a student who was caught smoking in the dormitory on Shabbos. Now that's a grave violation. And he was called into the Chafetz Chaim's office. And obviously he was a difficult student to begin with. This was like the straw that broke the camel's back. The Chafetz Chaim spent 5 minutes with him. And he walked out a changed man. He became one of the top students in the yeshiva. And he said, no one knows what happened in that office. But all we know is in 5 minutes he took the student who was completely off the path and brought him back to become one of the best students in the yeshiva. And he said that's the power of knowing what to say, how to influence and inspire people. At the end of the lecture, an old man in Miami Beach walks over to Rabbi Wine and says, you know that story you told? I was that student in Poland in the yeshiva. I was the student that the rabbi was smoking, and he called me to the office. And I've been a religious Jew ever since. And Rabbi Scheiner said to this man, really, what did he say to you in 5 minutes that changed you and turned your whole life around? He said, I walked into the room, I was frightened. I didn't know what the rabbi was going to do. I thought for sure he'd kick me out of the yeshiva. The rabbi was sitting behind his desk. He got out from behind his desk, from his chair. He came up to me, and he took my 2 hands in my hands. And he looked me in the eyes, and he started to cry. And tears were streaming down his cheeks, falling onto my hands. He said, I could still feel his warm tears 70 years later on my hands. And he said, he looked at me and he said, Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbos. And he said it with so much love and so much care for me that it penetrated my heart, and I resolved I would never violate the Shabbos again. It's not what we say with force and power that changes lives. It's what we say with love and care. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was told by Hashem. You're not being punished that you can't go into the land of Israel. It's just a new generation. It needs a new type of a leader that knows how to speak the language of this new generation.